Some stories do not ask to be told. They resist being spoken. They sit quietly in the corners of history, heavy with discomfort, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover them. This is one of those stories. It is not a tale of romance. It is not a legend meant to inspire pride. It is a reminder of what happens when power exists without accountability and when human beings are reduced to property. To understand this story, we must return to a time when slavery was not hidden in shadows but written into law, a time when silence was survival and obedience was enforced through fear. On a vast plantation, surrounded by endless fields and guarded by tradition, lived a man who believed himself untouchable. He was the owner. In public, he was respected. In private, he was absolute. He owned land that stretched farther than the eye could see. He owned labor that bent under the sun from dawn to dusk, and most dangerously, he believed he owned destiny itself. No one questioned his decisions. No one challenged his authority, because in that world, power did not explain itself, it simply commanded. Inside his grand house, built with wealth drawn from suffering, life appeared orderly, quiet, controlled. But control, when pushed too far, begins to rot from within. The owner had a daughter. She was raised in privilege, educated in manners, and taught obedience disguised as virtue. From the outside, her life seemed protected. But protection without choice is just another form of imprisonment. She was intelligent, observant, and painfully aware of the world she lived in. She saw the enslaved workers every day. She heard their silence. She noticed how quickly laughter disappeared when her father entered a room. Yet she also knew something else. Her life, despite appearances, did not belong to her. In that era, a daughter was not an individual. She was an extension of her father's will, a symbol of honor, a tool for alliances. And then there was the slave, one man among many, yet his presence would become central to a decision that would haunt everyone involved. He was not remarkable by the standards of that society. He had no title, no recognized family name, no legal identity beyond ownership records. But he was observant, quiet, and deeply aware of the dangers of being noticed. He worked, he obeyed, he survived. Every day he carried the weight of a system designed to erase him as a human being. And like so many others, he learned that survival meant keeping his thoughts hidden and his emotions invisible. Two lives existed under the same roof of power, one protected by status, the other crushed by it. They were never meant to intersect until one night, everything changed. The decision was not announced publicly. There were no witnesses, no ceremony, no justification offered. The owner summoned the slave. The command was brief, cold, unquestionable. In that moment, the slave understood something terrifying. This was not a request. This was not negotiable. And elsewhere in the house, the daughter realized that a choice had been made about her life without her consent. The decision had nothing to do with love, nothing to do with morality, nothing to do with tradition as it was publicly preached. It was about power. The owner believed that his authority extended beyond social boundaries, beyond human dignity, beyond consequence. He believed that by forcing control over others, he could shape outcomes according to his will. What followed was not spoken of openly. It was wrapped in silence, locked behind closed doors, hidden behind routine. But silence does not erase impact. The house changed. Servants moved more carefully. Conversations stopped when footsteps approached. The air itself felt heavier, as if the walls were absorbing what could not be said. The daughter withdrew. Her confidence dimmed. Her presence became quieter, more guarded. And the slave, the man expected to disappear back into invisibility, did not. Because something unexpected happened. Instead of breaking, he endured. Instead of reacting with chaos, he observed. He listened more than he spoke. He remembered more than anyone realized. And slowly, he began to understand that the very system designed to erase him had underestimated one thing: his humanity. This story is not about portraying cruelty for shock. It is about understanding how systems of power collapse when they assume people are incapable of thought, feeling, and choice. The owner believed fear was permanent, that obedience was absolute, that silence meant control. He was wrong, because silence can also be patience, and patience, when combined with awareness, can become something dangerous. As days passed, consequences began to form, quietly, subtly, but undeniably. The daughter began to question everything she had been taught. The slave began to see cracks in the authority that once felt immovable. And the owner, confident in his control, failed to notice the shift happening inside his own house. History often focuses on loud revolutions, on battles and declarations, but some of the most powerful changes begin quietly, in observation, in endurance, in a single decision to no longer accept what is presented as fate. This is where part 1 ends, not with resolution, not with justice, but with tension. Because what comes next is not what the owner expected, not what society anticipated, and not what history was eager to record. And before we continue, if you value stories that explore history honestly, without glorifying cruelty, without hiding uncomfortable truths, then make sure you subscribe to this channel. Here, we don't rush narratives, we don't simplify pain. We tell stories the way they deserve to be told, with depth, context, and respect. Subscribe and stay with us, because this story is only beginning, and what follows will challenge everything you think you know about power, silence, and human resilience.
Power has a way of convincing itself that it is permanent. Those who hold it begin to believe that fear will last forever, that silence equals loyalty, and that control does not need to be defended once it has been established. This is where power makes its greatest mistake. Because silence does not always mean acceptance. After the owner's decision, life on the plantation appeared to return to normal. The fields were worked, orders were given, the routines continued. From the outside, nothing seemed different. But inside the house and inside the people, everything had changed. The daughter moved through the halls like a shadow of who she once was. Her steps were quieter. Her gaze lingered longer on small details, as if she were searching for meaning where she had once found certainty. She no longer trusted the rules she had been taught. She had grown up believing that authority existed to protect order, that her father's power was justified by tradition and responsibility. But now she understood something painful. Power was not guided by morality, it was guided by desire. And desire, when unchecked, did not care who it destroyed. She began to observe the world around her differently, the servants' eyes, their posture, the way conversations stopped mid-sentence when footsteps approached. What she once ignored, she now noticed. The house had always been quiet. She just hadn't realized why. Meanwhile, the slave returned to his assigned work as if nothing had happened. He did not speak of the decision. He did not ask questions. He did not show emotion. This was not because he felt nothing. It was because he understood something vital. Survival depended on appearing unchanged. Every movement was measured, every word considered. He became invisible again, or at least that is what the owner believed. But invisibility can be a weapon. The slave began to listen more closely than before. He noticed patterns in behavior, habits in speech, moments of weakness that others overlooked. He learned when authority was strongest and when it was careless. He understood that power relaxes when it believes it has won. The owner, confident that his will had been enforced, turned his attention elsewhere, to business, to reputation, to maintaining the image that kept his position secure. He did not notice the distance growing between himself and his daughter. He mistook her silence for obedience, but silence had become her shield. In private moments, she began to question everything she had accepted as truth. She thought about the lives that existed only to serve, about the system that demanded suffering to maintain comfort. And most of all, she questioned her father, not out loud, but internally, where doubt grows strongest. She realized that fear ruled the house more than love ever had. As time passed, subtle shifts became impossible to ignore. The owner noticed that servants no longer avoided his daughter's presence. Their fear had changed. It was no longer sharp and reactive, but quiet and deliberate, the kind of fear that has learned endurance. He dismissed it as imagination. The slave, however, noticed something else. The owner was not as observant as he believed himself to be. Arrogance had dulled his awareness. Small opportunities began to appear, conversations overheard, instructions given too casually, doors left unlocked because authority assumed compliance. The slave did not rush. He waited, because waiting in a world that expects immediate obedience is an act of resistance. At the same time, the daughter made a choice of her own. She began to speak, carefully, selectively, and only when necessary, not in defiance, but in questions, questions that unsettled without accusing, questions that exposed contradictions without open challenge. She asked about the future, about responsibility, about the cost of maintaining order. Her father dismissed her concerns as confusion. He believed control over her was guaranteed by blood. He was wrong, because blood does not erase conscience. The house, once unified by fear, began to fracture under the weight of unspoken tension. Servants shared looks, whispers traveled faster than commands, loyalty shifted, not toward rebellion, but toward survival beyond submission. The owner felt the change but could not identify its source. And when power cannot identify its threat, it often responds with excess. Rules became stricter, punishments harsher, surveillance tighter. But this only accelerated what he feared. Because fear, once pushed too far, stops working. The slave recognized the moment clearly. Authority was no longer confident, it was anxious. That anxiety created mistakes, and mistakes create openings. One evening, an opportunity emerged, quiet, unplanned, and easily overlooked. It was not dramatic, it was not violent, it was simply a moment when the system relied on habit instead of awareness. The slave acted, not recklessly, not emotionally, strategically. What he did was not an act of revenge, but an assertion of existence. He forced the system to confront a reality it refused to acknowledge, that the people it tried to erase were still thinking, still adapting, still human. The consequences were immediate, not explosive, but undeniable. The owner's authority was questioned for the first time, not publicly, but within the structure that supported him. Trust fractured, control slipped. The daughter witnessed this shift with clarity. For the first time, she saw proof that power could be challenged, not through violence, but through understanding its weaknesses. She realized that the system her father upheld was precisely because it depended on obedience without thought. The owner responded the only way he knew how, by tightening his grip. But it was too late. Once doubt enters a system built on fear, it cannot be removed. The plantation continued to function, but its foundation had cracked. Relationships changed, allegiances shifted. Silence no longer meant submission, it meant calculation. The slave did not become a hero in the traditional sense. There were no speeches, no recognition, no immediate freedom. But something more important had occurred. The illusion of absolute power had been broken, and once broken, it could never be fully restored. The daughter, now fully aware of her position, faced a choice of her own: continue benefiting from a system she no longer believed in, or risk everything by refusing to uphold it. Her decision would not be immediate, but it would be inevitable, because once truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. History often remembers moments of collapse as sudden, but collapse is usually slow, made of small realizations, quiet resistance, and decisions that refuse to disappear. This story does not end with justice neatly served. It ends with transformation, with power exposed, with silence redefined, with humanity reasserting itself in a place designed to erase it. And this is why stories like this matter, not because they are comfortable, but because they reveal how systems fall, not through force alone, but through awareness. If you want to continue exploring stories that challenge power, question history, and center human resilience, make sure you subscribe to this channel. We don't glorify cruelty, we examine it. We don't simplify the past, we confront it. Subscribe and stay with us, because the most dangerous thing to any system built on fear is a person who understands how it works. And this story proves exactly that.
One cruel decision, one slave, and the owner's daughter, when power finally collapses. Every system built on fear eventually reaches the same moment. The moment when control no longer feels natural, when authority must constantly remind others of its existence, when power, once unquestioned, begins to demand obedience instead of receiving it. That moment had arrived. The plantation still stood, the fields were still worked, orders were still spoken, but something essential had shifted. The owner felt it, not as a clear thought, but as a constant irritation, a sense that his presence no longer commanded the same invisible obedience it once had. People listened, yes, they complied, but something was missing: certainty. He responded the way men like him always did, by tightening rules, reinforcing hierarchy, and reminding everyone who held power. But authority that needs repetition is already weakening. The slave noticed this immediately. He saw it in the owner's posture, in the way commands were repeated twice instead of once, in how punishment became less measured and more reactive. Power was no longer calm, it was defensive. And defensiveness is dangerous for those who rely on fear. The slave understood something that the owner did not. Systems collapse not when people stop obeying, but when they stop believing. Belief had begun to erode, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. The servants spoke less, yet shared more through glances. Instructions were followed precisely, but without loyalty. Work continued, but without fear-driven urgency. Fear had been replaced with calculation. Meanwhile, the daughter reached a breaking point of her own. For the first time in her life, she stopped trying to understand her father's authority and began to understand its cost. She saw how the house functioned not through respect, but through suppression. How comfort was maintained by suffering she had been trained to ignore. And she realized something deeply unsettling. Her silence had made her complicit. This realization did not arrive with anger, it arrived with clarity. She began to ask herself questions she had avoided for years. What kind of life was she inheriting? What kind of power would she be expected to maintain? And most importantly, what would it cost her to continue pretending not to see? The owner noticed the change in her, not in words, but in resistance disguised as calm. She no longer argued, she no longer pleaded, she simply stopped agreeing. That quiet refusal unsettled him more than open defiance ever could. Because defiance could be punished, but distance could not. As pressure increased, cracks widened. The slave observed an important truth. The owner's control depended heavily on routine, on predictability, on the assumption that tomorrow would look like yesterday. So the slave disrupted routine, subtly, not through chaos, through inconsistency. Tasks were completed differently, information traveled slower, small misunderstandings accumulated. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, but enough to create friction. The owner blamed incompetence, then disrespect, then betrayal. Each accusation pushed loyalty further away. At the same time, the daughter made her decision. It was not sudden, it was not emotional, it was inevitable. She chose to stop being silent. Not by exposing everything, not by confronting her father directly, but by refusing to benefit quietly. She stopped participating in rituals that symbolized control. She questioned decisions framed as necessary. She redirected resources in ways that reduced suffering rather than increased efficiency. Each act alone seemed harmless. Together, they changed the balance. The owner realized too late that power was slipping, not through rebellion, but through erosion. He tried to reassert dominance. He called meetings, he issued warnings, he reminded everyone of consequences. But the fear no longer worked the way it once had. Because fear, when used too often, becomes predictable, and predictability creates opportunity. The slave recognized the final opening not as a dramatic moment, but as a pattern. Authority had become reactive. That was enough. He did not attempt escape. He did not seek revenge. He did not expose secrets publicly. Instead, he did something far more effective. He forced the system to confront its own contradictions. Through carefully timed actions, he revealed inconsistencies in records, commands, and expectations. Not to challenge authority directly, but to undermine its credibility. Power depends on being believed. Once credibility collapses, power follows. Those above the owner, investors, partners, overseers, began to notice irregularities. Not accusations, but questions. Questions the owner could not answer cleanly. Doubt spread upward, and power hates nothing more than scrutiny. The owner lashed out, desperate to reassert control. But desperation only confirmed weakness. The daughter watched all of this unfold with painful clarity. She understood that the system was not falling because of one act, but because it could no longer hide its nature. She also understood her role in what came next. She did not attempt to seize power. She refused it. When given the opportunity to step into authority and fix the system from within, she declined. This refusal shocked everyone, because power assumes it is desired. Her rejection of it exposed the emptiness at its core. The owner, confronted with the collapse of everything he believed permanent, faced a truth he had avoided his entire life. That power without humanity destroys itself. He did not repent dramatically. He did not confess publicly. He simply lost control. And loss of control for someone like him was the ultimate punishment. The plantation did not disappear overnight. Systems like this never do. But it changed. The structure weakened. Oversight increased. Practices were questioned. And the illusion of absolute authority was gone forever. The slave did not become free immediately, but he became something equally dangerous to oppression. He became undeniable. His humanity could no longer be ignored. The daughter chose a different future, not one built on inheritance of power, but on responsibility for its consequences. History would not remember their names. It rarely does. But it would feel their impact. Because the most powerful revolutions are not loud. They do not announce themselves. They simply make the old ways impossible to continue. This story does not end with triumph. It ends with truth. That power, when stripped of fear, has nothing left to stand on. That silence can be resistance. And that even the most oppressive systems are fragile when people stop believing in them. If stories like this matter to you, stories that challenge how power operates, that examine history without comfort, then subscribe to this channel. We don't tell stories to entertain only. We tell them to understand, because understanding is the beginning of change. And this story is proof that no system built on cruelty lasts forever. One cruel decision, one slave, and the owner's daughter. What history never recorded. History often gives us the illusion of endings, a fall, a collapse, a final moment where everything changes. But real history does not work that way. Power does not vanish overnight. Systems built on cruelty rarely collapse in a single dramatic scene. Instead, they decay, slowly, unevenly, and quietly. After the owner lost control, life on the plantation did not suddenly become just. The fields were still there, the labor continued, the structure remained. But something essential was gone. Fear no longer unified the system, and without fear, authority had no center. The owner still lived in the house, but it no longer felt like his. The halls echoed differently. The servants moved without the old urgency. The silence he once relied on had changed its meaning. It was no longer submission, it was distance. He attempted to restore order by acting as though nothing had changed. He spoke with the same tone, issued the same commands, expected the same results. But power that pretends nothing has shifted only exposes how much it has. Those around him complied, but not instinctively. They followed instructions precisely, without anticipation, without loyalty. Every action was deliberate, measured, transactional. This unsettled him more than rebellion ever could, because rebellion confirms relevance, indifference does not. The daughter felt this shift deeply. For the first time, she experienced space, not physical freedom, but moral distance from the system that had defined her life. She could see it clearly now, without the haze of obligation, and what she saw disturbed her. She realized that cruelty had not only harmed the enslaved, it had hollowed out everyone involved, including those who benefited from it. Her father was no longer powerful. He was isolated. And isolation, she understood, was the natural outcome of domination. She did not confront him. She did not accuse. She simply stopped playing her role. She no longer defended decisions she did not believe in. She no longer explained away suffering as necessity. She no longer accepted comfort that came at the cost of others' pain. This quiet withdrawal carried more weight than argument, because it revealed a truth the owner could not escape. Power meant nothing without consent, even silent consent. The slave watched all of this carefully. He did not celebrate. He did not relax. He knew that systems in decline are often the most dangerous. When power realizes it is fading, it becomes unpredictable, and unpredictability creates risk. So he remained cautious. But he also understood something else. The rules were changing. Not officially, not legally, but psychologically. The owner no longer inspired fear, he inspired caution. And caution invites strategy. Opportunities appeared where none had existed before. Small choices mattered now. Timing mattered. Information mattered. The slave did not seek recognition. He sought sustainability. He aligned his actions with survival, not just his own, but others. He shared knowledge quietly, offered guidance without drawing attention, helped others understand when to comply and when to wait. This was not leadership in the traditional sense. It was influence, and influence is often more powerful than authority. Meanwhile, the owner became increasingly desperate to reclaim the past. He spoke of tradition, of legacy, of how things had always worked. But tradition is only persuasive when people believe it serves a purpose, and no one believed anymore. Those above him, investors, administrators, distant authorities, continued their scrutiny. They were not interested in morality, they were interested in stability. And instability had become undeniable. Reports conflicted, productivity fluctuated, control was inconsistent. The owner was no longer reliable. And in systems driven by profit and order, unreliability is unforgivable. Pressure mounted from all sides. The owner lashed out, not at the system, but at individuals. He blamed servants, accused workers, isolated himself further. But blame cannot rebuild trust. It can only accelerate collapse. The daughter watched this unraveling with a mixture of sorrow and clarity. She saw her father not as a villain, but as a product of a system that rewarded domination and punished empathy. That understanding did not excuse his actions, but it freed her from defending them. She faced a final choice: remain within the structure, attempting to soften its edges, or step away, accepting uncertainty over complicity. She chose uncertainty. Her departure was quiet, unannounced, undramatic, but it carried symbolic weight. The system had lost its heir, and systems obsessed with continuity cannot survive without succession. The owner understood what this meant, not immediately, but inevitably. Power had not only abandoned him, it had outgrown him. The plantation continued, but under increasing oversight. Authority became fragmented. Decisions were no longer centralized. What once depended on fear now depended on negotiation. This was not freedom, but it was change. The slave experienced this shift not as victory, but as possibility. He was still bound by the system, but the system was now bound by scrutiny. And scrutiny limits cruelty. He had not overthrown power, he had exposed it. And exposure changes everything. History would not record his role. It rarely records those who work quietly. But the effects of his actions would ripple outward, influencing decisions, altering practices, and weakening assumptions that once seemed permanent. The story does not end with justice fully realized. It ends with truth emerging. That power without humanity isolates itself. That fear cannot sustain control forever. And that even the most entrenched systems depend on belief to survive. Once belief disappears, collapse is only a matter of time. This is why stories like this matter, not because they offer easy hope, but because they show how change actually happens, slowly, unevenly, and through ordinary people who refuse to disappear. If you want to keep exploring stories that challenge history's silence, examine power honestly, and center human resilience, make sure you subscribe to this channel. We don't promise comfort, we promise clarity. Because clarity is where real change begins. And this story, like so many others, proves that even when history refuses to remember names, it cannot erase impact.
One cruel decision, one slave, and the owner's daughter. The ending history tried to forget. History does not end when tower falls. It continues in the silence that follows. After the plantation system began to weaken, there was no celebration, no moment where injustice vanished, no clear line between the old world and the new. What remained was something far more realistic: consequences. The owner still lived, the house still stood, the land still produced, but the meaning of power had changed. He no longer woke with certainty. He no longer moved through his home as if it were an extension of his will. His commands were heard, but they were no longer absorbed. They traveled through layers of hesitation, interpretation, and quiet resistance. This unsettled him more than outright defiance ever could, because defiance acknowledges authority. Indifference does not. The man who once believed himself untouchable now found his authority questioned, not by rebellion, but by procedure. Oversight replaced trust. Documentation replaced instinct.
Systems that once empowered him now restrained him. Power had not disappeared, it had moved away from him. And for someone who built his identity on control, this loss was unbearable. He responded the only way he knew how, by clinging to the past. He spoke often of tradition, of how things had always worked, of the necessity of order, but the words no longer inspired confidence. They sounded like excuses. Those above him, distant investors, administrators, and institutions, were not sentimental. They did not care about legacy or pride. They cared about stability, efficiency, and risk, and he had become a risk. Meanwhile, the plantation's internal world continued to shift. Servants and workers still followed rules, but they no longer internalized them. Compliance became mechanical rather than emotional. Fear, once the engine of obedience, had lost its effectiveness. Fear only works when people believe it is unavoidable. That belief was gone. The slave lived within this new reality cautiously. He understood that weakened systems are unpredictable. He did not mistake change for safety, but he also recognized opportunity. Not opportunity for escape or revenge, but for survival with dignity. His actions remained measured. He did not seek attention. He did not claim credit. He continued to operate within the boundaries of the system, but with a deeper awareness of its limits. That awareness was his protection. He noticed that cruelty now required justification, that excess punishment raised questions, that authority hesitated before acting openly. These were small shifts, but they mattered, because limitation placed on oppression is the first step toward freedom. The daughter, meanwhile, had crossed a threshold she could not return from. By walking away from her expected role, she had severed herself from the future that had been prepared for her. She did not know what awaited her next, only that she could no longer participate silently. Her departure was not dramatic. There were no confrontations, no public declarations. She left quietly, carrying with her the understanding that comfort gained through suffering was no longer acceptable. This choice did not make her a hero. It made her responsible. Responsibility, she learned, is heavier than obedience, but it is also honest. She would live with uncertainty, with loss of status, with questions about her place in the world, but she would live without denial. And denial, she now understood, was the true foundation of cruelty. The owner never fully understood her decision. To him, power was inheritance, authority was identity. The idea that someone would reject it voluntarily felt like betrayal. But in truth, it was rejection of the system that had shaped him, a system that rewarded domination and punished empathy. As the months passed, the plantation adjusted under new scrutiny. Authority became fragmented. Decisions required approval. The absolute control once held by one man dissolved into layers of accountability. This did not end exploitation, but it slowed it. And slowing injustice matters. The slave remained unnamed in official records. His life did not suddenly transform. Freedom did not arrive neatly or immediately. But something fundamental had changed. He was no longer disposable. The system now recognized limits, not because it had become moral, but because it had become cautious. And caution restrains cruelty. He had not overthrown power. He had not escaped the system. He had not been remembered, but he had shifted the balance. History often overlooks these moments. We remember revolutions, not erosion. We remember speeches, not silences. We remember leaders, not observers. But systems rarely fall because of one loud act. They fall because enough people stop believing in them. That belief had cracked. The owner lived out his remaining authority isolated from its former certainty. His world grew smaller. His influence diminished. He was no longer feared, only managed. And management is the end of dominance. The daughter built a life defined not by inheritance, but by consequence. She carried the knowledge of what she had witnessed, and she allowed it to shape her choices rather than erase them. This story matters because it reveals something essential about power. Power does not survive exposure, it does not survive scrutiny, and it does not survive when people stop participating in its illusions. The owner believed fear would last forever. He was wrong. Fear decays. The daughter was taught that obedience was virtue. She learned that conscience matters more. The slave was treated as property. He proved that humanity does not require permission. And that is the most dangerous truth of all. Because once people understand how a system functions, they begin to see its limits. And once limits are visible, inevitability disappears. History does not change in clean lines. It changes through pressure, through refusal, through awareness. This is why stories like this must be told, not to shock, not to entertain, but to remember. To remember that silence can be forced, but it can also be reclaimed. To remember that power depends on belief, and belief can be withdrawn. To remember that even when justice is incomplete, impact is real. And finally, to remember this: no system built on cruelty is permanent. If you value stories that confront history honestly, examine power deeply, and center human resilience, then subscribe to this channel. Here we do not offer comfort, we offer clarity, because clarity is where change begins. And this story, like so many others history tried to bury, proves that even when names are forgotten, truth remains.